Welcome back. The four most seriously injured victims of Friday's terror attack are now in a stable condition in Auckland Hospital, but 3 remain in intensive care. The scene examination has wrapped up at the New Lynn Mall, but questions remain over whether the attack could have been prevented altogether. Corazon Miller reports.
Paramedics train for events like Friday's terrorist attack, but hope they never see it for real.
It was more after the job where we reflected on what had actually just happened. It sort of sunk in a lot more for us.
You go home and you talk to family and friends and you see a bit more of it unravel and what happened, that you sort of feel a little bit differently about it.
3 years ago, there was hope this could have been avoided. A 2018 sentencing report deemed that he did not fit the characteristics of a person that seeks to commit violent acts, and that he was a low risk of serious offending. But there were also warning signs, with his probation officer noting he had a high sense of entitlement and a propensity for violence. An expert recommended a rehabilitation program aimed at de-radicalising him.
But a source tells One News this never happened. For most of the last 3 years, he was held as a prisoner on remand awaiting trial and was unable to access the court-recommended program.
I think it's really important that we intervene early on as soon as people are showing problematic signs.
In a statement, his family said he struggled in prison without support.
I know engagement occurred, but I do think that there is room for us still to look in a little more detail.
Any extremist, whether it's around disinformation, right-wing extremism, conspiracy theories, they all have in common that they don't trust the state.
She says a de-radicalisation program should have been in place 10 years ago.
This person, we did have the opportunity to deport him, but we know that there are extremists of all kinds of, in the country that we wouldn't be able to deport, and it's really important that we get this right.
The government is now working on a scheme. Too late for the victims in New Lynn, but if done right, there's hope better intervention could prevent more scenes like this. Corazon Miller, One News.
Mr. Speaker, there is much work to do. I don't want the response to this report to be political. Many recommendations, of which there are 44, relate to issues that we will seek consensus over. We will work hard to achieve that. But let me start by outlining some of the plan that we can announce from today. Recommendation 14, we will establish a national centre of excellence to prevent violent extremism and promote, Mr. Speaker, those preventative actions that are known to reduce radicalisation, and they do fall in the space of social cohesion. I do not call them social engineering, I call it prevention. Mr. Speaker, recommendation 42, which establishes an organisational response within the police to recording and managing hate crime. Also, early intervention programs across agency to address risk factors that we know lead to radicalisation. Recommendation 44, we will work with parties across Parliament on the gaps in hate speech legislation. I know this is a contentious area, and we will work with determination to try and form that consensus if we can. Mrs.
Thanks, that's great, Cameron. I think we have about 5 minutes or just over for questions, so I'm going to throw it up. Oh, there's one at the back there.
Oh, thank you. My name's Dr Justin Barry-Walsh I'm a forensic psychiatrist with Fixated Threat Assessment Centre based in Wellington, New Zealand, where we health works with police. And my question relates to evidence base. And I also have a brief comment first. The comment about sharing information, privacy is critical in the kind of services we work in, and we're fortunate that legislative frameworks actually do allow for the sharing of information. And I think the big trick is getting people in services and institutions to understand that you can share information. It's okay to do it. You have to have a system for it. You have to have a process for it. You've got to understand the issues around it, but it can be shared. My question relates to, as I said, to evidence. Our service is established on a very sound evidence base, but it's a very narrow service. What evidence base is there out there for any of these initiatives, any of the disengagement initiatives, any of the de-radicalisation initiatives, whether they're in Western Europe, Pakistan, the United States, wherever. Do we have any evidence that they work?
Thank you. Sorry, thank you very much for the question. And that's really good to hear that there are systems in place to share information appropriately in New Zealand. Yeah, the evaluation question is certainly an important one. And as I mentioned, oftentimes the make their evaluations public necessarily. I'm not sure if they share them between governments, and there are probably questions as to who conducts the evaluations as well. You know, like any prevention initiatives, it's always going to be difficult because you run into the problem of trying to prove or measure a negative. And PCV programs involve so many different variables, both in terms of the processes or pathways towards extremist violence, and then the context that may impact some of the outcomes of the intervention itself. So there are evaluations that are done, obviously, and made public, and they generally either focus on attitudes or behavior. So measuring attitudes is clearly pretty difficult, but there are strategies that are getting more sophisticated, that involve complexity theory, I think, is one of them. And then there are behavioral science experiments that look at behavioral change and try to prove that people are changing beyond just recidivism and the types of people that they're hanging out with. But yeah, certainly I could not point to a body of evidence that says that any of this definitely works. I think it's experimental, but I think it's important. And I think that it can also have benefits beyond solving terrorism, right? Like even if it doesn't fix every terrorist or de-radicalize every violent extremist, I think that it can bring benefits, like having different stakeholders work together on important social issues and you know, learn how best to work together. But yes, as I also mentioned, there are definite problems that can arise, such as stigmatization, which are clearly important to take into account as well.
We've got a question at the front.
Thanks. Hi, Cameron. It's Chris Wilson here from the University of Auckland.
Hi, Chris.
Hey. The main thing I wanted to say was thanks very much. That was a fantastic talk and really, really informative. The one thing I was really interested in was you mentioned airing of grievances, which I haven't actually heard before, and that sounds really interesting. And I'm wondering, is that done in a group context, or is it just individuals with contact people within government agencies, or just I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because I'm wondering if you are if they are in those houses bringing people together at different kind of levels of radicalisation or whatever pathways you want to talk about. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, so I've mainly heard about this in the context of mentors, but also in small group sharing sessions in prisons. There have been some interesting experiments. I keep saying the word experiment because it really is experimental work. And we've had people come and talk to us from France and from Italy that have conducted sort of group sharing sessions in prisons where they try to create a very sort of safe space for opening up and sort of talking about their political views without anybody sort of talking them down or shouting them down. I think obviously in prison that's sort of a different environment, but I think with the mentors, they perhaps try to get them into groups, civil society or NGO groups that work on particular issues but are very disconnected from any violent organizations. Perhaps some of this is controversial as well because some people would consider an organization that is not violent but potentially has intolerant views to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So, there's a bit of messiness there, whether you can use these non-violent but probably fairly intolerant groups to help bring people back from violence before possibly trying to bring people back from intolerance. I'm not sure. But yes, there are different experiments. Sorry, I don't really have exact examples on me right now, but I'd be definitely happy to talk to you later about it.
Great. We have time for one last question over here.
Kia ora, Cameron. Is this on? Yeah. So a key theme that has come out through the Hui is the real need to incorporate Te Ao Māori into any sort of work that we do in this space. And I think probably the best example that you would be able to speak to is Canada. Did they incorporate any First Nations wisdom or cultural practices in designing their program?
Thank you. Yes, I'm not sure, to be honest. The Canada approach is great because they have this Canada Centre, which is very similar to the what we're proposing in the Centre of Excellence, I feel. But instead of just conducting research and giving policy advice, they are more of a think and do tank, right? So they coordinate practitioners, and then they fund local initiatives at the community level as well. And there are a list of them in different cities that the Canada Centre supports, but does not manage. And at this point, I didn't see any particular involvement with First Nation groups, but they also cover a range of social issues, some of them at least, like in Toronto for sure. And I think that they have expertise covering a range of different issues as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are elements that are important to First Nation issues. But I haven't seen anything that is explicitly, relevant to First Nation people. But perhaps they're in development now.
Great, thank you very much, Cameron, and excellent segue to our afternoon as we discuss the development of our Centre of Excellence here in New Zealand as well, which is one of our next sessions this afternoon. So from me, a big thank you, a big huge ngā mihi nui. Thanks so much for joining us. I know it's a different time zone that you're coming in from, so we really appreciate you joining us via Zoom. Thanks for joining us here. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.